The cold wind rolled across the waters of Pearl Harbor before sunrise. Smoke still drifted above the harbor even though days had passed since the attack. Burned steel filled the air with a bitter smell that refused to disappear. Twisted battleships rested in the shallow water like giant skeletons. Oil floated across the surface in thick black patches. Rescue crews still searched dark compartments where trapped sailors had taken their final breaths. Every few minutes another body was carried ashore. Every face in uniform looked older than it had only a week before. The harbor was quiet, but it was not peaceful. It was the silence that follows a disaster too large for words. At that very moment, more than 4,800 miles away in Washington, one question haunted the White House. Who would take command of this broken fleet? Even the most respected admirals understood what that assignment truly meant. It was not simply another command. It was a career that could end in failure before it even began. Yet within days, President Franklin D. Roosevelt would make a choice that surprised almost everyone. He would place the future of the Pacific into the hands of a calm, quiet officer named Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the United States Navy had suffered one of the greatest shocks in its history. At 7:55 a.m., hundreds of Japanese aircraft swept over Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu in the territory of Hawaii. In less than 2 hours, battleships were burning, airfields were shattered, and thousands of American sailors, soldiers, and civilians were dead or wounded. The attack changed the course of the Second World War forever. It also created a command that many believed no officer could successfully lead. For years before the attack, Pearl Harbor had been the center of American naval power in the Pacific. The decision to move the Pacific Fleet from California to Hawaii had been intended as a warning to Japan. Instead, the fleet became the target of one of history's most carefully planned surprise attacks. The damage was enormous. Battleships including US Arizona, US Oklahoma, US West Virginia, US California, and others were destroyed, sunk, or heavily damaged. Aircraft lined up on airfields had become easy targets. Fuel tanks, repair yards, and docks somehow survived, but no one knew whether another attack would come within hours. Inside Washington, military leaders faced another frightening reality. Losing ships was terrible. Losing confidence could be even worse. Every newspaper in America demanded answers. Congress demanded investigations. Families demanded justice. Sailors demanded leadership. The Pacific Fleet needed a commander who could restore order while preparing for a war that was only beginning. Many Americans assumed admirals would compete for such an important command. The truth was almost the opposite. Senior officers understood exactly what waited in Hawaii. Japanese forces were advancing across the Pacific with incredible speed. Guam fell. Wake Island struggled against overwhelming odds. The Philippines stood in desperate danger. Malaya, Hong Kong, and the Dutch East Indies all faced invasion. Everywhere the news seemed darker than the day before. Whoever accepted command at Pearl Harbor would carry responsibility for stopping an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Among the officers watching events unfold was Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. Unlike many famous commanders of the era, Nimitz rarely searched for attention. Friends described him as thoughtful, patient, and remarkably calm under pressure. Those qualities had been built over decades rather than months. Long before newspapers printed his name, Nimitz had already survived moments that might have ended another career. He had been born on February 24, 1885, in Fredericksburg, Texas. His father died before he was born. leaving his grandfather to become one of the strongest influences in his life. His grandfather often spoke about responsibility, discipline, and calm judgment. Those lessons stayed with the young boy long after childhood ended. They would quietly shape decisions that later affected millions of lives. Nimitz entered the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1901. He graduated in 1905 near the top of his class. At a time when the Navy depended heavily on battleships, he became fascinated by engineering and new technology. He believed that tomorrow's victories would belong to officers willing to understand machines as well as tactics. His early career nearly ended before it truly began. In July 1908, while commanding the destroyer Decatur in the Philippines, Nimitz accidentally grounded the ship on a mudbank. It was an embarrassing mistake. He faced a court-martial and received a formal letter of reprimand. Many young officers would have allowed such failure to define their future. Nimitz refused. Instead of becoming bitter, he treated the experience as a lesson that every decision at sea carried consequences. Years later, officers who served beside him noticed something unusual. He rarely rushed decisions simply to appear bold. He believed careful judgment often required more courage than dramatic action. During the years before the First World War, submarines remained a new and uncertain weapon. Many senior officers dismissed them as interesting experiments. Nimitz saw something different. He volunteered for submarine duty when few others wanted the assignment. He studied diesel engines, underwater navigation, maintenance, and crew training with remarkable determination. His understanding of technology made him one of the Navy's leading submarine experts long before submarines became famous during the Second World War. His reputation continued to grow through the following decades. He held engineering assignments, commanded submarines, supervised training, and gradually earned promotion after promotion. Unlike officers known for loud personalities, Nimitz gained respect because he listened carefully before speaking. Junior officers trusted him because he remained calm even when problems seemed overwhelming. Senior leaders valued his ability to organize complex operations without seeking personal credit. By late 1941, Nimitz served as chief of the Bureau of Navigation in Washington. Despite its name, the position focused largely on personnel. He oversaw assignments, promotions, training, and the careers of thousands of naval officers and sailors. It was important work, but it kept him far from combat. While others commanded fleets across oceans, Nimitz worked behind desks, reviewing reports and preparing the Navy for future expansion. Then came December 7. The attack reached Washington quickly. Reports arrived one after another, each more alarming than the last. At first, no one knew the full extent of the disaster. Communications from Hawaii were incomplete. Some messages contradicted others. Rumors spread almost as fast as facts. Senior officials feared aircraft carriers might also have been destroyed. Fortunately, US Enterprise, US Lexington, and US Saratoga were not inside Pearl Harbor when the attack began. That unexpected stroke of luck would later become one of the most important facts of the entire Pacific War. As investigators pieced together events, responsibility naturally focused on Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and Lieutenant General Walter C. Short, Commander of Army Forces in Hawaii. On December 17, 1941, both men were relieved of their commands. Whether history judged them fairly would remain a subject of debate for generations. At that moment, however, Washington believed new leadership was necessary. Finding that leader proved far more difficult than replacing one name with another. The Pacific Fleet was no longer simply another naval command. It had become the center of America's fight against Japan. Whoever accepted responsibility would answer directly to the President, the Secretary of the Navy, Congress, newspaper editors, and millions of worried Americans. Every decision would be examined, every setback would become national news. Every success would still be measured against the disaster that had come before. Several experienced officers possessed impressive combat records. Others had commanded fleets larger than anything Nimitz had ever led. Yet experience alone did not guarantee success. The Navy needed someone who could rebuild shattered morale as well as shattered ships. Sailors needed confidence. Shipyard workers needed direction. Intelligence officers needed coordination. Carrier commanders needed freedom to act. Repair crews needed priorities. Every piece had to fit together with almost no time for mistakes. President Roosevelt understood the weight of the decision. He admired aggressive leaders, but he also knew reckless confidence could become dangerous. The Pacific did not need dramatic speeches. It needed steady leadership capable of surviving months of uncertainty. Nimitz never campaigned for the assignment. He never tried to convince politicians or senior officers that he deserved command. In fact, many people believed another admiral would receive the position. Yet as names were considered one after another, attention slowly returned to the quiet Texan whose greatest strength might not be boldness at all. It was balance. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox and Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Harold R. Stark both knew Nimitz personally. They understood his record, his professionalism, and his unusual ability to remain calm under enormous pressure. Roosevelt also respected officers who inspired confidence without unnecessary drama. During one discussion, Nimitz's name rose steadily toward the top of the list. The official order soon followed. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz would become Commander-in-Chief, United States Pacific Fleet. For many officers, receiving such news would have produced excitement. For Nimitz, it produced reflection. He fully understood what waited in Hawaii. Thousands of grieving families expected justice. Young sailors expected hope. The nation expected victories that no one could promise. The Pacific Fleet had lost much of its battleship strength. Japanese forces seemed to hold the initiative across nearly every front. Newspapers described the situation in language filled with fear. Some military observers even questioned whether Hawaii itself could withstand another major assault. As Nimitz prepared for the journey west, he gathered reports instead of headlines. He studied ship damage, fuel supplies, aircraft strength, repair capacity, intelligence summaries, and personnel shortages. Rather than focusing on what had already been lost, he searched for what remained. That habit would soon become one of his greatest strengths. Where others saw only destruction, Nimitz searched for possibilities. Late in December 1941, he boarded an aircraft bound for Hawaii. The flight crossed thousands of miles of ocean that had suddenly become one of the world's most dangerous battlefields. Somewhere below, Japanese submarines hunted Allied shipping. Enemy aircraft could appear without warning. Every mile carried him closer to the command that had terrified nearly every senior naval officer. When the Hawaiian Islands finally appeared on the horizon, the view looked peaceful from above. Blue water surrounded green mountains beneath bright tropical skies, yet appearances hid painful reality. Pearl Harbor was still wounded. Smoke stains marked shattered ships. Salvage vessels worked day and night. Divers disappeared beneath dark water searching damaged hulls. Hospitals remained crowded. Families still waited for news of missing loved ones. As Nimitz stepped onto Hawaiian soil, he did not arrive to celebrate a promotion. He arrived to inherit America's greatest naval crisis. The difficult part was only beginning. Nimitz officially assumed command of the U.S. Pacific Fleet on December 31, 1941. It was New Year's Eve, but there was nothing to celebrate. Pearl Harbor still looked like the aftermath of an earthquake. The shattered remains of battleships lined Battleship Row. The rusted hull of US Arizona still burned beneath the water. US Oklahoma lay overturned. Cranes stretched high above damaged ships, while welders worked through the night under bright lights. Every day brought another funeral. Every day brought another list of missing men. For many officers, this scene would have been a constant reminder of failure. Nimitz chose to see something else. He saw a fleet that was wounded, not destroyed. One of the first things he did surprised many people. Instead of focusing only on the ships that had been lost, he carefully examined what Japan had failed to destroy. The great dry docks were still standing. The machine shops had survived. Huge fuel storage tanks remained untouched. Submarine facilities were operational. Most importantly, America's aircraft carriers had not been inside the harbor during the attack. That single fact changed everything. Battleships had represented the old Navy. Aircraft carriers would define the new one. Nimitz understood that faster than almost anyone. During his first inspections, he rarely raised his voice. Sailors remembered seeing him walk slowly through damaged areas, asking careful questions instead of making dramatic speeches. He spoke with mechanics covered in grease, divers exhausted from underwater work, and young officers who had survived the attack. He wanted facts before opinions. He believed leaders who listened first made better decisions later. That calm attitude slowly spread through the fleet. Men who had expected anger found confidence instead. The pressure from Washington never disappeared. President Franklin D. Roosevelt wanted action. The American public wanted revenge. Newspapers published headlines demanding immediate victories. Yet Nimitz refused to rush into reckless operations simply to satisfy public emotion. He knew Japan wanted the United States to make desperate mistakes. The Pacific Ocean covered more than 60 million square miles. Every aircraft, every destroyer, every submarine, and every gallon of fuel mattered. Wasting resources during the opening months could lose the war. At the same time, Japanese forces continued their rapid advance. In January 1942, they captured strategic positions across Southeast Asia. Singapore would fall in February. The Dutch East Indies soon followed. The Philippines fought bravely, but General Douglas MacArthur's forces faced overwhelming odds. Every report arriving at Pearl Harbor carried more bad news. It seemed as if the Japanese Empire could not be stopped. Many commanders would have become trapped by constant crisis. Nimitz focused on building strength one step at a time. He encouraged aggressive submarine operations against Japanese shipping. American submarines would eventually become one of the most effective weapons of the Pacific War, cutting supply lines that Japan depended upon. At the beginning, however, submarine crews struggled with faulty Mark 14 torpedoes that often failed to explode. Instead of blaming individual captains, Nimitz insisted on investigating technical problems. He understood that successful warfare depended on honest reporting, not protecting reputations. He also placed enormous trust in naval aviation. The Carrier Task Force became the heart of his strategy. Rather than concentrating ships into one vulnerable group, he encouraged flexible formations capable of striking quickly and disappearing before the enemy could respond. This approach demanded excellent coordination between pilots, ship captains, intelligence officers, and logistics teams. It also required confidence in younger officers who had never before carried such responsibility. Another strength separated Nimitz from many commanders. He knew he could not fight the war alone. He selected talented officers and trusted them to perform their missions. Men like Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr., Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, and many others brought different personalities and strengths to the Pacific Fleet. Halsey was aggressive and energetic. Spruance was calm and analytical. Fletcher had valuable carrier experience. Instead of forcing every commander to think exactly like him, Nimitz encouraged initiative while maintaining clear strategic goals. That balance became one of the greatest advantages enjoyed by the United States Navy. Behind the front lines, another secret battle quietly unfolded. At Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his intelligence team worked around the clock trying to break Japanese naval codes. Their work rarely appeared in newspapers. Most sailors never knew their names. Yet the information gathered inside those rooms would soon influence some of the most important decisions of the entire war. Nimitz respected intelligence officers because he understood that accurate information could save thousands of lives. Rather than ignoring uncomfortable reports, he welcomed evidence even when it challenged existing plans. In April 1942, America finally struck back. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle led 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers from the aircraft carrier US Hornet in a daring raid against Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The physical damage was limited, but the psychological effect was enormous. It proved that Japan itself was not beyond American reach. Nimitz understood that morale mattered almost as much as military strength. Every successful operation reminded sailors that victory remained possible. Still, the greatest test had not yet arrived. By May 1942, Japanese planners prepared another major operation. Their next objective would eventually lead to one of history's most famous naval battles. Thanks to Rochefort's codebreakers, American intelligence gradually identified the target as Midway Atoll. Some senior officers questioned the intelligence. Others feared it might be a deception. Nimitz carefully studied every report. He weighed uncertainty against opportunity. If the codebreakers were correct, the United States could prepare an ambush. If they were wrong, precious aircraft carriers might sail directly into disaster. The decision rested with him. It was one of the loneliest moments of his career. He ordered US Enterprise and US Hornet under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, along with US Yorktown under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, to move into position northeast of Midway. Yorktown had only recently been damaged during the Battle of the Coral Sea. Many experts believed repairs would require months. Workers at Pearl Harbor accomplished what seemed impossible. Around the clock, they repaired enough damage to return the carrier to battle in only a few days. Nimitz trusted their work. It was a calculated risk that reflected his confidence in the men serving under him. On June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway began. Japanese carrier aircraft attacked Midway Island while American carrier forces waited beyond the horizon. The first hours were confusing and costly. American torpedo squadrons suffered terrible losses. Aircraft attacked without fighter protection. Many brave crews never returned. For a time, it appeared the battle might end in another disaster. Then everything changed within minutes. American dive bombers located the Japanese carrier force at the exact moment enemy flight decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Between approximately 10:20 and 10:25 that morning, US Enterprise's dive bombers struck Akagi and Kaga, while aircraft from US Yorktown fatally damaged Soryu. Later that afternoon, Hiryu, the last surviving Japanese fleet carrier, was also destroyed. 4 of Japan's finest aircraft carriers were lost. The victory shocked the world. Although many courageous pilots, sailors, intelligence officers, and commanders earned credit for Midway, the battle also reflected Nimitz's leadership. He had trusted intelligence when uncertainty remained. He had trusted younger commanders with enormous responsibility. He had accepted calculated risks instead of acting from fear. Most importantly, he had transformed a fleet recovering from Pearl Harbor into a force capable of defeating the Navy that had seemed unbeatable only 6 months earlier. The war was far from over. Bloody campaigns awaited at Guadalcanal, the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Thousands more Americans and Japanese would lose their lives before peace finally returned. Yet historians often point to Midway as the moment when strategic momentum began shifting toward the United States. As the months passed, Pearl Harbor itself also changed. Ships that had once rested beneath the water returned to service after remarkable salvage efforts. Repair yards expanded, airfields filled with new aircraft. Supply depots grew larger. The harbor that had symbolized defeat slowly became the center of an offensive stretching across the Pacific Ocean. Visitors noticed something about Admiral Nimitz. Success never changed his personality. He remained soft-spoken. He rarely celebrated himself. When victories came, he praised the sailors, marines, soldiers, pilots, engineers, codebreakers, shipbuilders, nurses, and civilian workers who made those victories possible. He understood that no admiral wins a war alone. Looking back, it becomes clear why Pearl Harbor Command had terrified so many senior officers in December 1941. They were not afraid of responsibility itself. They feared inheriting a disaster so overwhelming that failure seemed unavoidable. The Pacific Fleet had been wounded before the eyes of the entire world. Expectations were impossible. Resources were limited. The enemy appeared unstoppable. Yet Franklin D. Roosevelt saw something others almost overlooked. He did not choose the loudest admiral. He did not choose the officer with the biggest public reputation. He chose a leader whose greatest weapon was judgment. Chester W. Nimitz never promised miracles. He never claimed victory would come quickly. Instead, he built trust, encouraged innovation, listened to experts, and made difficult decisions without allowing emotion to control him. That is why his story still matters today. Leadership is often imagined as dramatic speeches and fearless charges into battle. Pearl Harbor proved something different. Sometimes leadership begins by standing quietly in front of destruction, refusing to panic, and seeing possibilities that others cannot yet see. When Nimitz first arrived in Hawaii, twisted steel filled the harbor, smoke darkened the sky, and defeat seemed to surround him from every direction. Few people could imagine that the same harbor would later launch the forces that carried the United States across the Pacific toward final victory. The command that every admiral feared became the command that defined one of the greatest naval leaders in history. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. The hardest assignments are not always given to the loudest men. Sometimes they are entrusted to the calmest one in the room, the leader who sees beyond today's ruins and quietly begins building tomorrow's victory. One careful decision at a time.